He wore his best shirt, pressed the collar flat, ran his fingers across the buttons twice, and looked in the mirror just long enough to remind himself, "You got this, son." That's what Elijah always told Malcolm. Keep your head up, keep your shoes clean, and speak like you mean it. That morning, Malcolm did all three. They caught the 612 bus from Jackson to Oakfield, Mississippi. A straight shot if the traffic held up. Elijah sat on the window side, callous hands folded, his janitor's badge still clipped to his work belt. Malcolm was next to him, nervous but smiling, watching the world slide by. It was a job interview, not just any job, an actual office with air conditioning and computers and clean floors. First real opportunity. Elijah had saved every extra dollar for that shirt and tie, told Malcolm. This ain't just a job. This is your start. Welcome to Injustice Browning. I'm Mark Joie. If you're hearing this and it's hitting something deep inside you, subscribe. Stay here with us. Leave a comment below, because stories like this, they don't get told unless we carry them together. The bus rolled past cotton fields and chain link yards. The sun was beginning to dip low, pouring a thick orange heat across the dirt roads. Inside the bus, it was quiet. Just the hum of the engine, the rustle of newspapers. A white couple 3 rows ahead, a young black mother with 2 babies sleeping on her chest. Nobody saying much. Then it happened. The bus hissed to a stop too early, not at a stop sign. The driver, a white man in his late 50s, thin face, sweat-stained collar, stood up and turned his head slightly. He didn't say it loud, just low enough to keep from sounding like an order. "You, in the blue, mind stepping off?" Elijah looked up, confused, glanced down at his shirt navy blue, looked at Malcolm, then back at the driver. "Is there a problem?" The driver scratched his jaw, didn't answer, just muttered something under his breath and reached for the little radio mounted to the side panel. The kind wired straight to county dispatch. The woman with the baby stirred, looked around. Something about the air went still. 5 minutes later, a sheriff's cruiser pulled up behind the bus. 2 officers stepped out, one with sunglasses, even though the sun was almost gone, the other with a hand resting a little too comfortably on his belt. They didn't ask for IDs, didn't ask for statements, just pointed. "Elijah Green," the tall one said. Elijah nodded slow. "Yeah, that's me. What's this about?" "Need to ask you a few questions." "Step off the bus." Malcolm turned. "Sir, my dad didn't do anything. We're just—" One of the officers raised his hand. "Son, you need to stay seated." Elijah stood, looked down at Malcolm, then touched his shoulder. "It's all right. I'll just be a minute." Malcolm never saw him again. What happened outside that bus was never recorded. No dash cams in '84. No cell phones. Just the word of 2 white deputies and a bus full of silence. The official report would later say Elijah resisted, that he became agitated, that he lunged. But that wasn't Elijah. That wasn't who he was. He was a man who scrubbed cafeteria floors with his bare hands. A man who never raised his voice unless he had to shout over the vacuum cleaner. A man who carried dignity like a burden and passed it down like a gift. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. Then the cruiser pulled off. Without Elijah, Malcolm stood in the aisle, panic rising in his throat. Where is he? Where'd they take him? The driver just shrugged. Ain't my job to know. The mother with the babies put her hand on Malcolm's arm, whispered something soft, but the words didn't land. All he could feel was heat in his chest and cold in his fingertips. By the time he made it to the station, Elijah was gone. Not booked, not processed, not on any record, just gone. They told Malcolm he'd been released, walked out on his own, probably went home, they said. But Elijah never made it home. He wasn't in the backyard, wasn't on the porch, wasn't anywhere. His wife sat on the steps for hours, calling the hospitals, the jails, the city morgue. No answers, just echoes. The next morning, they found his body in a ditch 5 miles outside town. Blunt force trauma to the head, internal bleeding, hands bruised like he tried to cover his face. No weapon, no charges, no officer's name. The coroner said he tripped, said he must have fallen. Nobody falls that hard. Malcolm sat at the funeral, shirt wrinkled, eyes hollow. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just stared at the closed casket, knowing the man inside didn't deserve to go out like that, knowing that somewhere out there, someone was sleeping fine, eating dinner, laughing at a joke, while Elijah Green's name was being filed into silence. That's how it starts. Not with screams or sirens, but with a glance, a shrug, a whisper, into a radio. They don't need a reason, not sometimes. They just need a man who looks like he's had too many dreams, and a son who watches him disappear. One bus ride at a time. Aggressive behavior. That's what the report said, printed in black ink, stamped and filed like it meant something. Subject became hostile, refused to comply. Matched the description of a suspect wanted for questioning. Those were the first words Malcolm read. When they let him see the file 2 weeks later, a handful of papers, cold language, no footage, no signatures, just one name tucked inside the folder like a ghost. Deputy Ray Keller. That name carried weight in Oakfield. Not the kind you earned, but the kind you wore like a badge that couldn't be touched. Folks knew him, said he was a disciplinarian. Strict, but fair, old school. But not many people asked who he was being strict to, or who he was being fair with. Deputy Keller had a face like stone square jaw, thin mouth, eyes that didn't blink when he looked at you. He called himself a keeper of order, but the only thing he ever really kept was control over black men, over poor folks, over silence. Malcolm remembered his voice. Just before his father stepped off that bus. We just need to talk, just a couple questions. That voice, calm, coated in fake concern, Malcolm would replay it in his head over and over for years. The lie hidden inside every word. The town paper printed the story the same evening. Man found dead outside town. Paragraphs that read like a mistake happened. No outrage, no questions, just a picture of the sheriff standing by the highway, arms crossed, sunglasses on, and a half smile like none of it touched him at all. The next day, Malcolm went to school. People whispered, some stared, some avoided him entirely. Teachers didn't ask how he was. Friends didn't know what to say. One boy, a white kid in his class, leaned in and said, I heard your dad attacked a cop. Malcolm's knuckles were white, but he didn't hit him. He just walked out the room. He'd already seen enough violence. The church gave their condolences. Polite words, soft hands, but nobody asked why the officers weren't questioned. Nobody stood up in the pulpit and called it what it was. Even Reverend Carter, the same man who once marched in '68, told Elijah's wife, we need to pray and move forward. The Lord will handle the rest. But Malcolm wasn't ready to hand this over to God. He started digging. Quietly, sat in the back of the library after school, flipping through old town records, found a case from '79. Another black man arrested by Keller, claimed he was assaulted in custody. Case dropped. Then another in '81. Then a teenager in '82. All fit the description. All walked in fine. Came out with broken ribs, busted lips, or in one case, not at all dialed for complaints. All swept clean, every time. The same phrase showed up in reports. Subject was non-compliant. That word, like a death sentence in disguise. But you wouldn't know any of that walking through Oakfield. On Main Street, folks smiled at Deputy Keller. He sipped coffee at the diner, tipped his hat to shopkeepers, made jokes with the mailman. He was the kind of man they trusted with a key to the city. The kind of man who knew who to keep in line. Malcolm started to realize something no one ever taught him in school. It wasn't just the man with the badge. It was the man who printed the paper without question. The neighbor who watched Elijah get taken and said nothing. The preacher who told them to forgive. The liar who wouldn't take the case. The teacher who changed the subject. The folks who saw the bruises but closed their blinds. It was all of them, because silence is loud, and it always stands on the side of power. Malcolm asked his mother one night, what if I said something? Back on the bus, she just looked at him with eyes too tired to cry. They'd have taken you too. That's what it meant to be black. In Oakfield in 1984, you didn't just fear the bullet. You feared the shrug, the closed door, the polite apology that came 2 weeks too late. And the worst part, that always made you the story, not what happened to you, but how you reacted to it. Malcolm didn't yell, didn't march, didn't light anything on fire. He just started watching who pretended nothing happened, watching how a lie, once printed, became truth, and watching how the world could carry on just fine, so long as it wasn't their father in the ditch. The coroner's report said it plain: accidental death, likely fall. Closed the case in less than a week. No hearing, no trial, no names. No justice. They sent a letter to the house, folded, sealed, tapped in clean black ink. That's how the system says goodbye, not with answers, Just paperwork. The town moved on. They always do. Storefronts stayed open. Church bells kept ringing. Kids still rode bikes past the place Elijah's body was found like it never happened. Like his name wasn't worth remembering longer than a Sunday headline. But Malcolm couldn't move. Not past the front porch. Not past the smell of his father's coat still hanging on the door. He stopped going to school, started walking the long way home, fists clenched in his pockets, looking for someone to blame, something to hit. He got into fights, 2 of them in the same week. Came home with a busted lip and dirt on his knuckles. His mother didn't say a word, just looked at him, wiped his face, went back to work. She picked up another shift at the nursing home, started cleaning houses on weekends. Every night she'd come home late, shoulders slumped, back sore, lips pressed tight to keep from crying. She made dinner with one hand and folded laundry with the other. She didn't talk about Elijah, not once. The silence in that house grew so thick it started to feel like furniture. Malcolm would sit on the steps some nights, watching the streetlights flicker, waiting for a shadow that would never come up the path. Then one day, she sent him to stay with his grandmother for a weekend, just a break, a change of air. He didn't want to go, but the second he stepped into that house, something different hit him. The air smelled like cinnamon and old wood. There were pictures on every wall, faces of people he barely knew, names he'd only heard, whispered. His grandmother was in the kitchen, shelling peas, humming something low under her breath. She didn't hug him, just nodded toward the back porch. Come sit. They sat there in silence for a while, just the creak of the old rocking chair, the wind slipping through the screen door. Then she spoke. You think this only started with your daddy? Malcolm looked over, confused. She didn't wait. You ever heard of my brother, Jesse? He shook his head. She kept shelling peas, eyes fixed forward. He was 23, quiet boy, worked at a shoe shop in Clarksdale. One night he walked home the wrong way. White girl said he whistled at her. Next morning, they found him hanging from a tree. No trial, no names. They called it suicide. Same lie, different year. Malcolm didn't speak. She nodded slowly. Your daddy saw that. He was just a kid, and he carried it. Right here. She pressed her hand to her chest. Then he saw his own father, my husband, get dragged out of a courtroom and beaten half to death for talking back to a judge. Survived it, but he never looked anyone in the eye again. She looked at Malcolm then, right into him. You wonder why your daddy was always so careful, why he told you to keep your shoes clean. Your voice steady, your head down. Malcolm nodded. It's 'cause he knew. This country don't need a reason. It just needs a moment. And he was trying to keep you safe from it. She stopped shelling peas. Her voice dropped. But safety don't always come. Malcolm's throat burned. His fist clenched again. But she reached over and took his hand before he could speak. Listen to me, baby. That pain you feel, that weight in your chest, that's been passed down like a name, like a scar. It's in your blood, but it ain't just there to break you. It's there to build you. He looked down. She squeezed his hand. Some people run from it. Some bury it. But some of us, we carry it until it turns into something sharper than steel. Malcolm didn't say anything. He just sat there, let her words settle into the silence his father left behind. That night, he looked through the old photo albums on her coffee table, saw pictures of Elijah as a boy, smiling, laughing, sitting on a porch just like this one. He wasn't always the tired man who worked double shifts and came home with sore feet. He had dreams once. He had light in his eyes, and someone took that away. Malcolm stared at the photo for a long time. He didn't know what he was going to do. Not yet, but he knew this. He wasn't going to let his father become just another name in a file. He wasn't going to let that silence win, not without a fight. He didn't plan it all at once. It started with a folder, a plain manila folder, tucked away in the back of his closet, under old shoes and a box of church programs. Inside it were the articles, the report, the photos, his father's obituary, a bus ticket stub, a torn page from a notebook where Malcolm had written the deputy's name over and over again, until the ink bled through. For years, that folder sat untouched, but never forgotten. Malcolm got older, grew taller, quieter, sharper. He got a job, stacking shelves, then another one fixing air conditioners. Took night classes at the community college. Read every book he could afford, underlining words like justice, accountability, civil liability. He didn't know what he was going to do with any of it, But he knew why. Every step, his father's name stayed close. Every long shift, every cold morning, every test, every late bus ride through neighborhoods that never felt safe, Elijah Green's voice was there, whispering between the cracks. 10 years later, Malcolm sat at his kitchen table. Same hands, different purpose. He picked up a pen and wrote a letter. He didn't start with rage. He started with facts. My name is Malcolm Green. My father was killed in 1984 by law enforcement under suspicious and undocumented circumstances. I have evidence of misconduct. I am requesting an investigation. He mailed one to the Department of Justice, one to the Jackson Advocate, one to 3 different civil rights law firms. Most never responded, but one did. It was a small, black-owned legal center based out of Birmingham, run by the former public defenders who had seen too many cases like his. They invited him to come talk, told him, bring everything you got. He brought the folder. Then he brought more. Malcolm started showing up at courthouses, public records, archive libraries, anywhere with boxes full of paper that nobody had read in decades. He requested arrest logs, internal memos, complaint files, and he found them. For other men, for black men, all had been stopped by Deputy Ray Keller. Between 1979 and 1985, one hospitalized, to beaten and released with no charges. One Eddie Banks reported missing in 1980 to no body, no investigation. Just gone. Malcolm made copies, built a timeline. He called families, drove across counties. One man was still alive. His name was Lester. Walked with a cane and didn't trust anyone, but he agreed to meet. Sat across from Malcolm in a faded lawn chair and said, Keller cracked my ribs for calling him sir. You think anyone listened? I was 19. They talked for hours. Lester cried once, then signed a statement. Piece by piece, the silence started to split, but Malcolm wasn't done. There was one voice he needed to hear, the bus driver. He found him living in a trailer just outside Natchez, retired, 72, skin like paper. Malcolm knocked twice. The man opened the door and froze. You were there, Malcolm said. You remember. The man's eyes fell. He didn't ask who Malcolm was. He already knew. They sat at the kitchen table, same way Malcolm had sat across from his grandmother 10 years before. The driver didn't deny it, didn't excuse it. He just said, I made the call. That's all they needed. His hands shook. He lit a cigarette, but didn't smoke it. I thought, maybe if I just cooperated, it'd stay quiet. But when they took your daddy off that bus, I knew what was coming, and I let it happen. Malcolm didn't yell, didn't threaten. He just stared. I don't need a statement, he said. I need the truth. The man looked him in the eye for the first time. He never raised his voice. He never touched nobody. He just stood there, confused, like he'd seen it all before. That was all Malcolm needed. He left with nothing in his hands, but everything in his heart. He had witnesses. He had patterns. He had a story they couldn't bury anymore. He gave the file to the lawyers in Birmingham. They took it straight to federal court, filed for reinvestigation, citing racial bias, obstruction of justice, and excessive force leading to wrongful death. It wasn't fast. It wasn't clean, but it moved. 10 years of silence broke open with a single letter, because Malcolm didn't disappear. He didn't forget. He remembered every detail. And now, they would have to remember too. He didn't wear a suit that day. Just a white shirt, clean, pressed, no tie. Malcolm stood on the courthouse steps, a decade older, a decade louder, with a folder in his hand and his father's voice in his. Bones, the same courthouse where his grandfather was dragged out, the same town that once called Elijah Green aggressive, that tried to write him off with a single word. Now they had to listen. The trial wasn't big, no cameras, no headlines, screaming for justice, but the courtroom was full, quiet, tense. Not a sound when Malcolm took the stand. His voice was steady, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he'd spent 10 years rehearsing what the world refused to hear. He told them everything. He told them about the bus ride. The lie, the silence, the bruises. He told them about Keller's pattern. 5 men, 5 stories, 1 badge. He read out Lester's testimony, showed the missing reports, named every name the town had tried to forget, and when the defense asked him, were you there when your father died? He said, I was there the moment they decided his life didn't matter. There was no noise after that. Just the sound of justice turning in his sleep. Deputy Ray Keller sat at the defendant's table. No uniform, no badge, just a faded suit and a mouth that didn't open once. His lawyers called it circumstantial, called it too old, too distant, too complicated. But the jury didn't buy it. Not this time. They found him guilty. Official misconduct, obstruction, voluntary manslaughter. The sentence wasn't life. It wasn't even long, but it was on record. His name, finally, sat beneath the word guilty. And Elijah's? It wasn't an accident anymore. Malcolm didn't celebrate. He didn't throw his fist in the air. He didn't chant or shout or cry in front of the cameras. There weren't any cameras anyway. He just walked, alone, quiet, down the dirt road outside town, to a small graveyard most folks never visited. He stood in front of the stone that said, Elijah Green, 1949 to 1984. Nothing else. No quote. No honor. Just the years. But this time, Malcolm brought words with him. He looked down, let the silence hold for a moment. Then he said it. They finally said your name. His voice cracked just a little. You were never angry, Dad, never loud, but you deserve to be heard. You deserve more than a ditch and a lie, and now they know. He placed the folded verdict on the grave. Let the wind catch the edge. This won't bring you back. It won't fix what they broke, but they remember. You now. They don't get to forget. He sat down next to the stone, just for a while. Listened to the trees, the wind, the sound of everything his father never got to say. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. It whispers. Sometimes it doesn't come when you need it. It waits, buried in files. In mouths too scared to speak. In boys who grow up with fists clenched and hearts full of fire. It waits for someone who won't shut up. Someone who keeps asking, keeps naming names, keeps showing up, even when there's no gun. No badge. No chance, just a name, and the will to make the world remember it.